Hi everyone, so in this video I want to talk about something that we've basically already seen, and that is the difference between velocity and force. What I have here is a simple setup, just a sphere and a pop net, and it just scatters on the sphere and nothing happens. So we have no gravity or anything. What we've already seen is that you can set a start velocity in the source node under attributes and then set initial velocity, and I set all the variances to 0. And let's say I only put the velocity to -3 because that would mean it's in this direction. And I have my geometry spreadsheet open here with the geometry object selected, and I show velocity and force. And when we run this, what you can see is if I set a start velocity and there's nothing else in my simulation, then this will never change. So the start velocity will stay intact over time, so it never slows down by itself. This is basically a vacuum we're talking about here, where when you give something a start velocity, it will keep that velocity. Now this is different, and let's turn this back off, to a force. So we've seen a pop force, for example, where when you set a number, let's say an x of -1, you're not just setting a speed, you're actually setting an acceleration. You can see that quite clearly, how the points actually go faster. And you can see that also here in the geometry spreadsheet, how the force is staying at the number we gave it, but this accelerates actually the velocity. So this is very important to keep in mind, the relationship between the two. And also what you can see is that you can read this out, and not only can you read it out, you can also set it yourself, for example, with a pop wrangle. So we can override the velocity constantly, which is important because this is what we're doing here. It's important for you to understand that this is not a start velocity, but this node is actually run every single frame. So currently, by setting this, we're overwriting the velocity every frame. And that's, of course, the reason why it's -300. But we can also just set the force to, in this case, let's say -100, just like we set in the pop force. And technically now we did the same thing as with the pop force, just manually. And this is really all there is to it. But again, what you can see, it constantly accelerates our points and makes them faster. A similar thing we've already seen kind of with, you've seen that pop force actually creates a force attribute. But you also have seen that pop wind behaves a little bit differently because it doesn't constantly, it doesn't constantly accelerate, but it actually just tries to reach this velocity. And it will never go faster than -100. And also there is an acceleration. But what you can see, this is not a force technically. There is no force attribute coming out of this because it will not constantly accelerate. For example, not if it's lower than -1, then the points will not go faster, as you can see here. Another thing maybe worth showing in this context is when I set the velocity again, the start velocity, which will never slow down by itself, we can actually put in a node that slows it down, which is a pop drag. Then, even though that's not a force in that sense, because you don't see a force attribute, of course, the points will be slowed down because this node just changes the velocity. Or you can use basically the same thing, which is a drag force, which doesn't only work with points, but with anything, which then again is kind of weird because everything in Houdini is points. But you can use both and they work the same way. So as you can see, velocity and force cannot only exist at the same time, they also influence each other in a way that a force is increasing the velocity or is accelerating the point. And in technical terms, what you could also say is a velocity is changing the position of the point every frame, whereas a force is changing the velocity of the point every frame. And this is kind of the logic you should keep in mind. So quite important for everything that comes later in Houdini, we will always work with velocities or force or both. Okay, so I hope this is helpful and made sense. Thank you very much and see you later. Cheers.